Welcome to our week of daily uploads, where every day this week we'll be uploading a new Top 5s video to give you as much entertainment as possible this week, because why not? Now before we get started, there's two things we wanted to mention, and you can go ahead and skip around a minute or so if you do not want to hear this. One is the launch of Destination Declassified, our alien and UFO channel. If you have an interest in exploring the possibility of alien life and UFO visitations, then check out Destination Declassified for all things alien and UFO. We'll be covering some incredible topics over the next few weeks, and anyone interested in our place in the universe does not want to miss out. Secondly, and for the small minority of people who've not heard this before, consider becoming a patron for just $2 per month, and you'll get exclusive access to documentaries that we do not upload to YouTube. We already have hours of documentaries over there for you to enjoy, such as a documentary on the Vietnam War, the mystery of D.B. Cooper, and the secrets of the American White House, talking about underground tunnels and alien communication. You can enjoy all that for just $2 per month. And we'd like to say a massive thank you to all the patrons, as we would not be able to keep up the documentaries and the upload frequency that we have across all of our channels if it was not for the Patreon support. Your contribution is massively appreciated. Now, we never wanted to put our documentaries or any videos behind a paywall, and for that reason, we give free access to all those people who are unable to pay $2 per month, especially during these troubling times. So if you genuinely cannot afford to become a patron, just email patreon@top5s.co.uk and we'll give you access to the content for free. Now, thanks for listening, and with all that out of the way, let's get into this video. In recent years, it's become almost impossible for commercial planes to disappear without explanation, with many of them now tracked by both radar and satellite, meaning their location can be carefully tracked and their performance monitored throughout their flights. Of course, these systems won't help if a deliberate attempt to sabotage a plane is used, such as in the case of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 that disappeared on March 8, 2014, that to date has not been located and is thought to be somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Although we're not going to cover that one in this list, as we have previously looked at it extensively in other videos. We're going to look at 5 other unsolved aviation mysteries from an era when it wasn't so easy to track planes, and they either mysteriously disappeared without trace or crashed without explanation. Before we get started, if you want to watch one of our documentaries on the biggest aviation mystery of all, the disappearance of D.B. Cooper, then click on the link in the description to become a patron for just $2. If you are not in a position to afford, as we know many of you have been affected by the virus, then just email patreon@top5s.co.uk and we will give you access to the content for free. Now, let's get started. Flight 967 Varig. On the 30th of January 1979, Varig Flight 967 departed Narita International Airport in Tokyo for a cargo flight to Rio de Janeiro International Airport in Brazil. On board were 6 flight crew, the captain, the first officer, 2 second officers and 2 flight engineers, as well as cargo of over 50 paintings by the Japanese-Brazilian artist Manabu Mabe, with an estimated worth of over $1 million. The paintings were being shipped back home to Mabe's home in Brazil after an exhibition in Tokyo. The flight route plan included stops in Los Angeles, California and Lima. The captain that day was Gilberto Aruja da Silva, who was considered a hero in France and Brazil after in 1973 he landed Flight 820 in Onion Field south of Orly after a fire broke out in a toilet. By steering the stricken plane to a field, he avoided crashing into a populated area of Paris. And although 123 people lost their lives, the figure would have been far higher if it wasn't for the action taken by Gilberto. He was also a very experienced pilot with more than 23,000 hours flying time logged. Flight 967 departed on time, and 20 minutes after takeoff, the crew contacted Narita Tower for a routine checking, reporting that they were 500 kilometers from the coast, about 300 miles. The next call was expected about 40 minutes later, but never came. The tower controllers frantically tried to make contact for the next hour, but received no response. They declared an emergency, and the Japanese Air Force and Navy immediately set up a search. The following day, the Japanese Coast Guard and the US Air Force joined the search. Aircraft and ships scoured the area for the next 8 days, trying to find any sign of the Boeing 707, but no wreckage or trace of the cargo and crew were ever found. At the time, the Brazilian media stated that it was the only commercial jet to have disappeared without leaving a single trace, with no distress message and no wreckage found. Speculation was rife, and many believed that the aircraft had been hijacked in order to steal the artwork. However, none of the paintings have ever resurfaced. Others believed that the aircraft had drifted into Soviet territory and was shot down, just as Korean Airlines 902 had been just the year before. Either that, or it was intercepted and forced to land in the Soviet Union, as rumours circulated that as well as the paintings, the cargo included a dismantled MiG-25 that 3 years earlier had been flown into a Japanese airport by Soviet defector Viktor Belenko. At the time, the then US President George H.W. Bush called the opportunity to examine the plane up close an intelligence bonanza for the West. Belenko was later offered asylum by the US. It seems likely that the Soviet military would do almost anything to keep their powerful fighter jet out of American hands. However, it was later established the MiG was not part of the cargo, although the Soviets wouldn't have known that at the time. Then of course there were those that believed the aircraft had been abducted by aliens. The investigation into the disappearance of the plane, however, gave no credence to any of these theories, instead concluding the flight suffered an unexpected depressurization, causing the crew to lose consciousness about 30 minutes after takeoff, with the Boeing continuing on the same altitude and heading until it ran out of fuel and crashed somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. To date, that is where the story ends. There have been no updates and no further leads, and it's unlikely we will ever find out what happened to the flight and its crew. The stolen 727. On May 25, 2003, shortly before sunset, aircraft mechanic Ben Padilla boarded a Boeing 727-223. With him was a helper he had recently hired, John Matantu, from the Republic of the Congo. The two had been working with Angolan mechanics to return the 727 to flight-ready status so they could reclaim it from a business deal gone bad. However, John was not a pilot, and Ben had only a private pilot's license, and a 727 ordinarily requires 3 trained aircrew. It would have been nearly impossible for just 2 men to have operated this kind of plane. There is speculation that a third unseen person may have hopped aboard as well, or was already in the aircraft. Whatever the situation, without receiving clearance, the aircraft began moving erratically down the runway at an airport in Angola. There was no communication with air traffic controllers before it took off without lights and headed southwest over the Atlantic Ocean and then disappeared. The 28-year-old plane had a bit of a checkered background. It was once owned by American Airlines and was still partially decorated in the airline's signature metal look with red, white and blue livery. But it had recently been sold to US company Aerospace Sales and Leasing and leased to TAAG Angola Airlines, reportedly to use in the diamond mines of West Africa. However, it failed to be used in over a year, and the airline racked up a reported $4 million bill in airport fees. Ben and John were hired to convert the aircraft to be used by another carrier, IRS Airlines, and when it took off, it had no seats and was carrying 10 500-gallon fuel tanks. It was a complete mystery why these 2 men would steal the plane, and it was thought there was more to it than simple theft. The FBI, CIA, State Department and Homeland Security all frantically investigated the disappearance, and the search for the plane stretched worldwide. The disappearance was just 21 months after 9/11, and terrorism was suspected. Rumours started circulating that maybe the plane was stolen for insurance purposes by the owners, or that it had been stolen with the intent to make it available to the criminal fraternity, or it was indeed a deliberate terrorist attempt. The fact that the FBI got involved suggests they knew more than they were letting on, and Ben's family have fought to get the case reopened as they believe the agency knows more than it will admit to. Over the years, there have been reported sightings of the plane, although they have never been verified. Then in early 2009, the wreckage of a 727 was discovered abandoned in the Sahara Desert of Mali in West Africa. At first it was believed that the Boeing must have crash landed there, but further investigation revealed that an ancient lake bed nearby had been converted into a makeshift airstrip, and that the aircraft had been landed there before being deliberately set on fire. Inquiries about the origins of the plane were hampered by the fact that it had been marked with the registration of a Saudi airline, although the real 727 with that registration had been destroyed in an accident some time before. An international criminal investigation linked it to the smuggling of huge amounts of cash and cocaine between Colombia, West Africa and Europe. On its final journey, according to a UN crime agency, it was carrying some 10 tons of cocaine when it landed. It was met by 9 jeeps bearing false number plates that took its cargo for distribution across Europe, while the plane itself was destroyed by the smugglers. Now it's never been proved that this 727 was the stolen Angola one, and no trace of either John or Ben has ever been found. But given that it's very hard to steal and conceal a Boeing 727, the chances are that seeing as this plane has been deliberately disguised, buried and destroyed, there is a strong possibility it's the same plane. But where Ben and John are is still a mystery. And there are still so many unanswered questions. Were they flying the plane? Was it hijacked? Was there a bomb on board? Did it crash over the ocean? Or was it repainted and used somewhere else and ended up in the desert? To date, there are no answers, and the case remains just as baffling as the day the 727 took off all those years ago. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501. On the 23rd of June 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was flying from New York's LaGuardia Airport to Seattle, Washington, when it disappeared into the night. Northwest Airlines Corp was a US airline which was founded in 1926 primarily to carry US mail. The aircraft for Flight 2501 was a DC-4 which had been manufactured in 1943. It was originally operated by the United States Air Force, and then by a postal operation before being purchased by Northwest in 1943. The end of the war meant that many surplus aircraft were sold to fledgling commercial airlines. It was used for a cargo service initially, but in 1950, 1 month before the crash, it was converted to a 55-passenger cargo coach aircraft. Flight 2501 was one of the DC-4 routes, a transcontinental service from New York to Seattle. The aircraft was in good repair, and all the maintenance records were in order. The flight crew who had flown the aircraft to LaGuardia reported it as mechanically okay before going off shift. All times are given as Central Standard, which was the time zone for the believed accident location. At 15:45 that day, Northwest released a special thunderstorm forecast. At around 6 p.m. on June 23, 1950, the flight crew of the Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 arrived at the Northwest Flight Control Office, an hour before their scheduled departure. They discussed the weather situation with the dispatcher and examined the hourly sequence reports. The forecast was for thunderstorms in the Detroit, Minneapolis area, with moderate to severe turbulence above 10,000 feet, and light to moderate turbulence below 10,000 feet. There was also a risk of a squall line developing. A squall line means heavy rain, hail, lightning, strong winds, and even tornadoes. Due to the conditions, the captain and the dispatcher decided on a cruising altitude of 4,000 feet, which seems very low for a transcontinental flight by today's standards. The flight routes had them stopping over at Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Spokane before reaching their destination of Seattle. Before takeoff, the captain requested an altitude of 4,000 feet for the initial routing to Minneapolis, but air traffic controllers were unable to approve it, as they had other traffic assigned at that level, so the final flight plan had a cruising altitude of 6,000 feet to Minneapolis. The pre-flight check was normal, and there was no reason to think that there was anything wrong with the aircraft. the flight departed LaGuardia Airport at 19:31 with 2 flight crew and 1 cabin crew member, along with 55 passengers on board, including 2 families travelling with their children and 3 pregnant women. One of the passengers was so late he almost missed the flight, and the cabin crew had to open the cabin door to let him aboard. The plane flew over Cleveland, Ohio at 21:49. The flight crew again requested a cruising altitude of 4,000 feet, which this time was approved. However, 40 minutes later, air traffic control asked them to descend to 3,500 feet, as other planes were experiencing turbulence due to the conditions. At 22:51, Flight 2501 was flying over Battle Creek at 3,500 feet, and reported that they expected to be over Milwaukee at 37 minutes past 11, although the radio operator incorrectly copied this down as 27 minutes past 11. At 13 minutes past 11, the flight crew requested a cruising altitude of 2,500 feet. They didn't say why, nor did they declare an emergency. Air traffic control declined the request, as there was other traffic at that level. The flight crew acknowledged that the descent was not approved, and the flight continued at 3,500 feet. This was the last communication from the flight. In Milwaukee, radio operators became concerned when the crew didn't check in at 37 minutes past 11 as expected. 10 minutes later, Northwest Radio still had not heard from the flight. Hoping that this was a communication failure, the controllers broadcast that the flight should circle the range station at Madison if its radio transmitter was inoperative. Meanwhile, all CAA radio stations in the Chicago-Minneapolis area attempted to contact the flight on all frequencies, with no success. Northwest contacted Chicago Air Traffic Control, who altered the air-sea rescue facilities in the area at 58 minutes past 11. Responders included the Air Force, Navy, Coast Guard, as well as the state police of Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Indiana. By dawn, it was time to face facts. No word was heard from the aircraft crew, and if they'd still be flying, the fuel supply would have run out by now, so they concluded the aircraft must be down. Search and rescue operations started searching Foggy Lake, Michigan as soon as the sun rose. The following morning, the search and rescue operation was expanded to include underwater searches. They loaded the boats with sonar equipment and sent divers down, where strong sonar contacts were made. The lake was 150 feet deep in these locations, and the lake bottom was covered by a layer of silt and mud, estimated to be 30 to 40 feet deep. The entire area was also dragged with grapnel hooks in the hopes of pulling something to the surface, but to no avail. That evening, after 11 hours of searching, a US Coast Guard discovered an oil slick on Lake Michigan, about 18 miles northwest of Benton Harbor. Meteorological reports confirmed that a squall line was located there at the time that the aircraft was believed to have crashed. The US Coast Guard also found the aircraft logbook floating in the water. Further floating fragments were found in the area, but they could not find the aircraft wreckage. After 4 days of intense searching, the Navy suspended their search because of the difficult conditions, and the official search was over. The only pieces of the aircraft which were recovered were things that floated, like foam cushions, armrests, clothing, blankets, pillows, and pieces of luggage. These recovered items showed no sign of fire, but were shredded, indicating that the aircraft must have struck the water at high speed. Soon, body parts began to wash up on the shore. Some were also described as shredded, and officials initially believed that there must have been a terrible mid-air explosion to disintegrate the bodies so badly. South Beach, popular with tourists, was forced to close because of the large number of body parts that washed in. Years later, 2 unmarked grave sites were identified, which are believed to hold the remains of the flight crash victims which washed ashore. They were buried quickly and quietly, as only small pieces were found. One is a mass grave in a cemetery near St. Joseph, and the other at Lakeview Cemetery in South Haven. Both sites now have markers in the memory of the victims. The only debris recovered offering any information about the flight was a plywood oxygen bottle support bracket. This bracket had been installed on the forward left side of the fuselage, which meant that the impact force which ripped it off must have been forward, downward, and to the left. This indicated that perhaps the aircraft had turned on its back in high winds, usually the flight crew would have enough height to recover. But as Flight 2501 was only at 3,500 feet, they had no chance. At the time, the crash was the deadliest commercial airliner accident that the United States had ever experienced, and no cause could be determined. To this day, the mystery continues. It's known the plane struck the water with considerable force, but why is unknown. It's possible that there was a mechanical failure mid-flight, but the aircraft appeared to be in good condition, and normally the flight crew would have reported as soon as they realized there were any issues. The Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates had searched Lake Michigan for the aircraft wreckage every year for over a decade. But even if they find the wreckage, they won't find the black box, as in 1950, commercial aircraft did not carry them. Over 60 years later, the aircraft has still not been found. The 1956 B-47 disappearance. On March 10, 1956, a Boeing B-47 Stratojet took off from the MacDill Air Force Base in Florida for a non-stop flight to Ben Guerir Air Base in Morocco. On board were Captain Robert H. Hodgin, the aircraft commander, Captain Gordon M. Inslee, observer, and Second Lieutenant Ronald L. Kurtz, the pilot. The unarmed aircraft was transporting 2 different capsules of nuclear weapons material in carrying cases, although it's worth pointing out a nuclear detonation was not possible. The aircraft completed the first of its 2 aerial refuelings without incident. However, after descending through solid cloud cover to begin its second refueling at 14,000 feet, it failed to make contact with its tanker. Its last known position was over or near the Mediterranean Sea, southeast of Port Said, an Algerian coastal village near the Moroccan frontier. This was the last anyone seen or heard of the plane and its 3 crew. Despite an extensive search by plane and sea, no debris was ever found, and the crash site has never been located. The 3 crew members have since been declared dead. It's a complete mystery how an aircraft, its cargo, and its crew completely disappeared off the face of the earth. This incident is one of the rare occasions when absolutely nothing turns up, despite investigators knowing roughly where the plane lost contact. The 64-year-old mystery rumbles on, with the usual speculation that other forces were at work, that either hijacked or downed the B-47. The Flying Tiger Line. At 5:45 GMT on 14th of March 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 departed Travis Air Force Base. On board, 11 crew and 96 passengers. The flight, chartered by the United States military, was heading to Saigon in South Vietnam, with refueling stops in Honolulu, Wake Island, Guam, and the Philippines. 93 of the passengers were jungle-trained Army Rangers, primarily highly trained electronics and communications specialists. The other 3 were members of the Armed Forces of Vietnam. The cargo consisted only of passenger baggage, personal articles, and clothing. The flight proceeded normally for the next 12 hours, arriving in Honolulu at 17:44 GMT. There the aircraft went through minor maintenance and no issues of concern were found. The next departure was at 20:40. The flight arrived at Wake Island at 3:54 on the 15th of March 1962. Again, minor maintenance was required and 4 cabin crews were replaced. The flight departed for Guam at 5:15. This leg was 6 hours and the flight arrived in Guam at 11:14. The next leg to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines was estimated at 6 hours and 19 minutes. The aircraft had enough fuel for 9 hours and 30 minutes. The aircraft departed Guam at 12:57. At 13:25, the flight crew contacted Guam International Flight Service Station to request a change in cruising altitude from 10,000 feet to 18,000 feet. No reason was given for the request, and the flight crew were advised to contact Guam Center, who approved the request. The last transmission from the aircraft took place at 14:22. The flight crew contacted Guam International Flight Service Station and reported cruising over the clouds at 18,000 feet. They expected to arrive at Clark Air Force Base at 19:16 and said that they had 18 hours and 12 minutes of fuel remaining. All of the radio calls were completely routine and there was no indication of any problem or difficulties. At 15:39, the operator attempted to contact Flight 739 in order to receive the now overdue 15:30 position report. He was unable to establish radio contact. At 16:33, after attempts to contact the aircraft had failed for over an hour, it was feared the aircraft was in danger, and search and rescue operations were initiated from Guam and the Philippines. At 22:27, by time, the aircraft would have exhausted all of its fuel. Tiger Flying Lines Flight 739 and all of its occupants were declared lost. The fate of the aircraft was unknown. However, a call came in from a ship out at sea. The lookouts had seen a mid-air explosion at 15:30. They explained the explosion consisted of 2 pulses lasting 2 to 3 seconds. The crew believed they saw 2 flaming objects of equal brightness and size fall at different speeds into the sea. As they fell, a crew member noticed a small bright target on the ship's radar, bearing 270 degrees at a range of 17 miles. The ship's captain ordered the ship to head to the target, and they searched the area for 5.5 hours but found no trace of wreckage or debris. At the time, the crew were unable to establish contact with the US Navy radio stations at Manila or Guam, and eventually decided that the explosion must have been some kind of military or naval exercise. The ship then broke off the search and resumed her course. The approximate location of the mid-air explosion was confirmed to coincide with the estimated position of the aircraft at that time, and coincidentally, it was at the point when Flight 739 should have been radioing in for the next position report. The subsequent search of the site was one of the most extensive ever conducted. However, no trace of the aircraft or its occupants was ever found. No explanation for its loss could be established, and although the plane had had mechanical issues in the weeks leading up to the disappearance, they had been fixed and it was in good order. Many believe the aircraft may have been sabotaged. The investigation found that the flight line and ramp areas at Honolulu, Wake Island and Guam were not secure, and anyone could enter and access non-military aircraft parked at the airfields. Specifically at Guam, the last stop, the aircraft was left unattended in a dimly lit area for some time. Although the Flying Tiger line stated at the time that sabotage or kidnapping of Flight 739 was a possibility, they had no evidence to back up the theory. But the executive vice president of the company was reported as saying that it was impossible for an explosion to occur on the plane in the course of normal operation, meaning something violent must have happened. Whatever happened must have happened quickly, as the crew never had a chance to alert anyone that there was an emergency. As no one has ever taken responsibility for sabotaging the aircraft and the wreckage, and the unwreckage is unlikely to be recovered, this is a mystery that may remain unsolved forever. So that's 5 chilling and unsolved aviation mysteries. If you're interested in another aviation mystery, then don't forget to check out our DB Cooper documentary on Patreon for just $2. You'll also get access to all of our other documentaries on there. And we're certain you won't be disappointed. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next video.